Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar on GST, Practical Insights into Audit and Investigation, hosted by Nextime. Before we begin, please note that you are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, please share them with us through the question box on the control panel. We will address your queries towards the end of the webinar or in writing if time does not permit us to cover them during the session today. Goods and Services Tax, hyped as Good and Simple Tax, has completed 4 years in July. While the law of such magnitude would continue to evolve and would take few more years to finally settle in, it is expected that businesses would start receiving notices from the GST department for review of the compliances and tax positions adopted during the initial 2 to 3 years period. In fact, this exercise has already been initiated in certain cases, where sizable data and documents have been called for to kickstart the first departmental audit under the new regime. In today's webinar, we will discuss different aspects of GST audit, inspection, search and seizure proceedings under the GST law, along with some practical insights. Today's session will be addressed by Saket Patwari. Saket is the Executive Director at Nextime and leads the indirect tax practice. He has 15 years of experience in indirect tax, advisory, policy advocacy, dispute resolution, and has headed indirect tax for one of the largest telecom company. He regularly addresses sessions, seminars organized by ICI, CTC, NASIN, and CII on GST and other indirect tax legislations and policies. Without any further delay, let us begin the session. Over to you, Saket.
Thank you, Jitin. Good morning, everyone.
It's been 4 years since GST has been launched. In this last 4 years, this was a historical change that happened in the country, because this is the first time the center and states came together and monitoring a particular law, and that to a taxation law where there is revenue involved. This is in that sense a great feat, if I may say so, for the taxation in the country, with a very noble objective of avoiding cascading of taxes. So that's and that's why it takes really a mettle to do this and to have to combine both the laws and work together. So if I have to give an analogy, instead of we know how marriages are. Marriages are between two people, and then we know how it goes on for years when it's a long-term marriage. Here we are talking about marriage between 1 and 36. 36 is to 1. All states versus the union. So therefore, we can understand the complexities, and we'll get to know some of the complexities as we move forward during our session. Okay, so let's start. So in GST, GST is a tax regime under self-assessment. In fact, all the taxes in India are now self-assessment. People who are senior in the profession would know there was a time in the excise regime where the price list, the classification list had to be approved by the department. In fact, all the invoices has to be pre-authenticated. All the excise invoices, because they carried credit, had to be pre-authenticated before before you could clear the goods. So therefore, that was the kind of control we had. Then sometime later, this control was released a bit, and then they came about on self-assessment. Not because they started trusting the taxpayer, that we all know currently, but because it was getting too voluminous, too data, because India was progressing. There were manufacturing getting expanded, services came about, which they realized it is impossible for them to manage things with this kind of volume. So therefore, they came about with a self-assessment regime. What does self-assessment mean? Self-assessment means that I, as a taxpayer, I'm supposed to evaluate what is the tax liability, find out the rate of tax, and pay the tax accordingly. That is what self-assessment means. So therefore, the way we do self-assessment is by filing our GSTR1 return, GSTR3B, GSTR various returns that we file. There we disclose what is our tax liability, what is our transaction, what is the tax liability that is payable. Otherwise, the other is filing of annual return that we do. So these are the mechanism in which we are self-assessing our tax liability and paying the tax. Okay. Now, once you have already self-assessed the tax, the next question comes is, as I already mentioned, it's not that the department started trusting us more. certainly earlier, compared to earlier regime, now it's more of mindset. There is a shift in mindset, but certainly not to the extent that they will completely have a trust on what the taxpayers are doing. In fact, today also they look at whenever there is some, and we'll see in audits and investigation, whenever something happens, to look upon us or the taxpayers with eye of suspicion. So yes, now what happens? We have filed our self-assessment tax or self-assessed tax. This thing, department is going to verify it, so that to understand whether everything is proper, whether there is the compliances has been done accurately or not. How do they do that? They do it by way of audits and investigation. Okay, so there are two methodologies: audit and investigation. Audit typically is, most of the audit that happens is by the tax officers. That is a person authorized by the commissioner undertakes the audit. Okay, and there is a special audit which is done by, see, these taxes and accounting, because you have to take the records from, you have to pull out the data from accounting software. These taxes and accounting, there can be, these tax officers may not be that well versed with accounting or the cost accounting. So therefore they then have nominate CA, chartered accountants, cost accountants, etc., who does audit on their behalf and provides a report to the deputy commissioner, assistant commissioner for doing so. This is another form of audit wherever they need specialized approach. But however, most of the audit is by the tax officers with their immense experience in excise, service tax, and VAT. They undertake the audit. The second piece of verification is investigation. Now, audit, most of us, many of our organizations have already seen or experienced audits and how it happens, and also you have fair idea of how audit will happen. We'll see what are the nuances in GST in a little while. But insofar as investigation is concerned, it is a different ball game. Not many have tasted it, or not many have seen that, but it's much more harsher, much more intriguing. So we'll discuss some aspects on investigation, which is, and we'll spend more time in investigation than the audit piece, because that is something which will have a bearing. And if you're not understand, or if you're not aware, then it may come as a shocker once we receive a summon or something. So that we'll see in a little while. Okay, all these two, assessment, verification of department, may lead and invariably leads to a litigation proceeding, which starts from a show cause notice, go in appeal, and then it goes on, and maybe till the Supreme Court, depending on what is the value involved, what is the issue involved. So this is broadly the departmental proceedings. Now let's move on to the some overview of GST audit. Next slide, please. Yeah, overview of GST audit. Now, what is audit? Is defined under section 213. I'll not go into technicalities about it, but what it is it is a detailed examination of records, returns, and other documents. Mind you, this other documents is crucial. What does that mean? Is it is not only the GST records that they're going to look at. They may look at non-GST records also, like income tax, your company law, whatever you're filing under company law or under SEBI, etc. They can look at all those things other than your GST records also. After all, GST is not a period tax like we have in income tax. It's a transaction tax. So therefore, every transaction could, or every kind of transaction could become an issue. So therefore, they'll corroborate information through various sources to see if there is any gap, if there is any miss that is happening. So that's a detailed examination of records. As I said, they'll not only review your compliances, but overall at a transaction level. Okay. Next slide, please. Yes, criteria for selecting audit. Now, while the department, there are various, there is no specifically, or not in the law there are criteria. It is more of risk assessment, assessing the risk parameters. The criteria are selected for audit, for carrying on the audit, and depending on that, you may have audits coming every year, every 2-3 years, or every 5 years, depending on the size of the organization, size of the operations, refunds, etc., that is being claimed, exemptions claimed. These are the various parameters that they look at. Variation, suppose if there is a big shift in terms of the what was reported earlier and what is getting reported now, Those can be also, criteria that will be looked at. Then any non-compliances, where is supplies without issuance of e-way bill or any kind of non-compliances may be there. Related party transactions are hot favorite, while in the GST law, most of the transactions, that was one of the big apprehension, that in case of related party, it can be any value, and then there may be disputes, unnecessary dispute. We have seen in the excise regime as well. So therefore, the law has come out in related party transaction that whatever value is adopted, it will be open market value if the credit is eligible. So that is really, really, limited the issue, but certainly related party transactions are one of the hot favorites. If there are old issues, something which is coming on in the past regime, are also, they that is already there with them, so they'll look at it from a GST perspective. And any other act, suppose if there is any other, if there is a bankruptcy, then there is a risk of department losing the money, so they may come about very easily, or other reporting that we have done. That's the criteria for selection of the audit. Then next we'll cover the timelines of the audit. Next slide, please. So timelines, there is no fixed timeline. While GST section 65(4) talks about within 3 months they have to complete. That's more of, practically, if you see, that's more of a recommendatory timeline rather than a mandatory timeline. Okay, so it says commissioner can extend to 6 months, which with for reasons to be recorded, which invariably extends if the operations are huge and if there are large volume transactions, if the tax office is taking time for doing this. So it may take some time. Period, typically they take a financial year, more than a financial year, even a part of financial year. So everything is open for them, but typically they take a financial year. And what is the time limit for the audit? See, there is no specific time limit for the audit. What the time limit gets governed by the limitation period by which a show cause notice can be issued, or an order needs to be issued, or demand needs to be issued. Even the earlier regime, even now. So it's 3 years typically where is the case there is no fraud, suppression, etc., or 5 years. Frankly speaking, when the audit gets initiated, they always, and we all know it, they always presume there will be fraud suppression. So they come with a presumption. So therefore, if it's say 4 years, if you say that, look, there is no fraud suppression, you can't do audit, they'll say, they'll not agree with it, because they'll say they have 5-year period. But mind you, this 5-year period is also from the filing of the annual return. So effectively from a transaction date, it becomes maybe about 6.5 years, or it becomes probably 6.5 years. So that's the time limit, which is governed by the limitation for under the GST law. The guidance as per the CBIC audit manual is for large taxpayer, if the audit is for 1 year, you should complete in 6 to 8 years, medium 4 to 6, and small 2 to 4 days. You should complete the audit. And if it's 5 years audit, then maybe it's 16, 12, and 8 days respectively. Again, this is a broad timeline. They will always have discussions, or they will always mention that the data was not received, this was not done, etc. So this timeline anyway would get extended, or kind of get extended. This is more of kind of making a more just as an information, or just as a guidelines, not as a mandatory requirement. Yeah. Now let's see what is the process flow of department audit. How does it happen? First, there is a notice which will be issued under ADT 01 for the SSC for auditing under section 65. One of the things that we must check whenever we receive an audit notice, or for that matter any notice from the department, whether it is a DIN, document identification number, which CBIC has asked that every government notice or letter should have a DIN. That gives us the authenticity, and then it is recorded on the government side that some of this communication has been issued. Now, I was just talking about little while ago between center and state. It's a marriage of 36. There is some, what I would say, some differences here. While the CBIC has mandated central government officers to do it, but there is other department, which is the state authorities. Some of the state authorities, for example, in Maharashtra, when we insisted there is no DIN, they mentioned in one of our clients, they mentioned that, look, that is not applicable to us. That's applicable to central authorities. We have not accepted it. So therefore, you may face a roadblock, but certainly whenever there is an audit investigation, etc., or any letter from central authorities, at least we must insist on it. Then even with state, we must kind of say so that there is uniformity there. Otherwise, there are divergent practices. It helps us to see the authenticity, and from a government point of view also, there is some sanctity to the letters that have been issued. Okay. Now, typically an audit would happen at an on-site. Very rarely you will see, except this COVID period where audits have been happening online, and they've been they have been agreeing to do an online audit, while they would always prefer to come and visit the office and do the audit, so that they are not only handicapped with the data that is submitted. They can, when they come about for audits, they may move around, they may look at other things, they may look at the ERPs of our companies, and then go through. So their scope gets expanded. So they would always prefer visiting to the SSC's premises for the audit. They can take, as I mentioned, they can take a walkthrough across the organization, across when they're auditing. But however, they cannot seize the goods or carry out search. It's not an investigation proceeding; it's an audit proceeding. So investigation, search, seizure, etc., they can't do. Okay, that's one of the critical difference between what an audit and what investigation happens. So they can review the records, take the records, ask for the copies of the record. They cannot do high-handed approach during audit. Okay, while audit, one point of view or one thing that needs to be taken care of is we should provide all the information that they are asked for, but let's not be over enthusiastic, because we are a honest taxpayer, to give things more what is needed. The more you give, the more length of the audit will extend, and more nitpicking may happen. So whatever they've asked for, we must give it, and we must review and give it. We'll see in a little while some of the examples of what we should be doing. That is something that we need to take care. Audit, while the time limit is 15 days to provide the information, data, etc., that may not be sufficient if the organization size is quite large. This may be a short period of time. Okay, that is one. Second, it may so happen that it's 15 days, but then they may be very aggressive in terms of timeline. They may want the data to be provided early on, etc. So there may be, these audits, there is always pull and push that will happen in terms of data, documents, etc., which we should not be too concerned. It's not a statutory or a hard timeline that you have to give the data in 15 days only. We can seek extensions. We can take time if it is taking time, if there is genuine reasons for it, because of some people not available, not well, etc. Those are the reasons that we can take to seek time. Unlike a order appeal, where if there is a hard casted timeline, there is no hard casted timeline to submit the data. While the recommended is within 15 days you must do it, and they may insist on it, but we can take time, and the officers are not too strict about it. They are pragmatic at times in doing so, unless and until it's getting too delayed. Now, once the audit is done, then there is a draft findings which gets shared. Almost all cases, or rather most of the cases, it gets shared. In some cases, they may not be also shared. Now, these draft findings provide their perspective when they have whatever they have done, review, etc., to us. And typically they talk about if they feel whatever is the liability, or if there is any liability that needs to be paid upon, that is the thing that they look at in these draft findings. So it's an opportune moment. It's an opportune moment for us to have the paragraphs dropped, the draft findings, by providing necessary information. One thing that we should always keep in mind is, in the draft finding, it should not so happen that the finding is because you have not given the data, we are presuming this is the liability, etc. That should not so happen. We should avoid that kind of a finding. All the factual information should be given. Okay. And now, one practical insight in terms of what do you do so far as if there is a dispute on legal terms or dispute of interpretation of law, there's some judgment call may have to be taken in those cases. The judgment call in the sense, see, if there is a debatable point, okay, we should not put all our cards in front of them, because whatever we put across, they will, if it's a debatable point, then there is all likelihood that they'll issue a show cause notice. Once they issue a show cause notice, if we have already provided our defense or what we are looking at, they may improve upon the show cause notice. It's more from a litigation point of view that it is a good practice that we should not give all our cards. But at the same time, if there are chances of the para getting dropped, okay, by providing information or providing some case law or something, uh, if there are those cases, then certainly it makes sense to provide our perspective to it. So it's a thin balance or a very, we are on a tight rope. It's a very delicate balance between what you submit and what you don't submit in terms of legal submissions are concerned. Factually, certainly we should submit because factually it will, otherwise it will go against us. Factually, we should submit. Legally, we should, we should have a fine balance between what needs to be given and what needs to not be given. After this draft findings are received, we will receive, there may be an opportunity for us to reply, as I was mentioning, and we need to take care of this. And post our reply, they may issue a final audit report along with a show cause notice as well. If they feel there is a demand, and more invariably they feel that there is a demand and recovery that needs to be done, they'll issue a show cause notice, which gets into a litigation proceeding, and we go forward in litigation by replying to the notice and adjudication, etc. Right? This is overall the departmental, the process flow of department audit. One thing that we should keep in mind is when they issue a audit para, final audit para or show cause notice, that is initiation of litigation proceeding. But you need not pay or you need not be forced to pay the demand. While they will insist that, look, this is the open and shut case, you pay up the amount. We need not do that. If we feel our case is good, a position may be taken, we will not make the payment, we'll litigate if we want to do that, right? So, and second, if we have to pay, they may insist on cash payment in terms of, bank RTGS or, bank payment. We can have the payment done through our ITC. If we have the input tax credit available, then we can have the payment made through that. While typically they insist, nowadays they have stopped insisting, even if the credit is fine. But at times it may happen is they may insist, no, you need to pay tax via DRC and in cash, not in credit, which we can, typically we can use ITC also. Yeah, next slide, please. What is the data requirement for departmental audit? So, insofar as data requirement is concerned, there can be, what is that they look at? They will look at on profiling of the taxpayers. What is the tax? How is the taxpayer profile? What industry is he in? How is it happening? What is the kind of vendors they have, customers they have, whether there is a higher amount of risk. That is the data they would want to analyze or to see what is the risk involved there, whether the returns have been filed. Then there are whether Tran 1 details are hot favorite because the audits have been started, the first audit. So Tran 1 would be something that they'll look at because suddenly from a physical documentation or something that you had, that the tax office has, the tax authorities had control of, now is becoming a tax, now has gone into ECL, electronic credit ledger, and it's reflected on the government portal. So they would want to see whether that credit that you have taken from earlier regime is appropriate or not. Reconciliation is again a very important or hot favorite that they look at, and we'll see what sort of reconciliation that they can ask for. And financial reports are annual audits, company law filing, income tax filing, TP report filing, all those things may be looked at. Then apart from that, next slide please. Non-GST related data requirements are in terms of various, as I was mentioning, income tax report. Next slide please. Sorry, yeah. Financial statements, income tax report, etc. Transfer pricing, I've already covered that. So these are the or intercompany agreement. These are the kind of non-GST related data that they may ask for. Yeah. Next slide, please. Audit. So there is a set process, or there are manuals. There are annexures in the manuals which provides all this data that I've spoken few minutes ago. What is taxpayers profiling, constitution of business, etc. in forms of GST-AM Annexure 1. So this will, these information or a questionnaire will come to you with all this information, etc. to be provided. Then there will be a comparative analysis in GST-AM Annexure 5, where they'll ask for the comparison between various filings that we have done, cost audit report, IT report, trial balance. Can we go to the hyperlink? Yes, this is the kind of format of GSTAM and Excel 5, where if you see, they are comparing the reporting that we have done through the various filings through 99C and then cost audit report, income tax, and etc. So they'll compare all the data, and whenever they feel there is inconsistency, they'll question around those inconsistencies. Yeah, can we get back? Yes. So there'll be questionnaires, there'll be, and the questionnaires would be there for inward as well as outward, internal control systems there, stock analysis and accounting procedures followed, etc. These are the, broad information. It's a host of information that is being asked for, which needs to be carefully filled in, and all the data information that is given that needs to be carefully looked at before it is shared. Yeah, next slide, please. GST is based on reconciliation. There is a host of compliances that happens in GST. In GST, we know it's a first time that we have seen a transaction level compliances. Now, not only a transaction level, multitude of compliances for the same transaction. For example, we have an e-way bill. Okay, when the goods move out, there is an e-way bill that generated. So there is a data with the tax office of e-way bill. Then there is a GSTR1 filing that we do, where we do the transaction level reporting of all B2B transactions. That data they have. And now e-invoicing. So there is, the e-invoicing gets generated. Now they have this is the third data. They would compare all the three data. Okay. Now for a same transaction, there are three levels of data or three kinds of data to three different sources. It's only in book or in there is bound to be differences because of various reasons. Some error happening, something else happening, because of which there are differences, which needs to be reconciled and answered to. And if there is a penalty, etc., for not filing one of them, say e-way bill, etc., then that those proceedings may get initiated. So reconciliation is very critical. And we know now, recently, in the last budget, the government has done away with certification by a chartered accountant of the GSTR 9C, which is the reconciliation statement from financials versus the books. Now, what it see, when there was a third party review of that being done, even the tax office had more comfort, because at least someone has looked at and they can catch hold of some professional who is under the CA body, because there is some sanctity to it that is there, that they could have done. So there was higher degree of satisfaction or higher degree compared to what it is now on them, that this reconciliation is accurately done and they have reported what needs to be reported. Now since that is done away with, it's the onus again, like the self-assessment, the onus is again with the taxpayers to do this reconciliation. So therefore there'll be, in audits we expect there'll be a higher degree of scrutiny that will happen once this happens. Once for even this reconciliation, some things which are in others, etc., may be looked at more minutely. That needs to be taken care of. That's one. Again, miscellaneous income or other income is something that is very, very important. That's the first thing that they look at, because it's an income. Why it is not taxed? And if it is taxed, then you have to discharge GST. And also that's the first thing that they invariably look at almost in all audits that we have seen. Okay. Then those reconciliation on the inward side or the outward side that we have also seen, to a reconciliation on input tax credit, 3 e-way bill, e-invoicing, etc., on the output side. So those are the reconciliation that would be looked at by them, which we need to be prepared for it. And if there is any if they come about with any exposures, etc., then they'll highlight what is the exposure coming up. Maybe there is a delay in filing, so a late fee may be there or some penalty may be there. Yeah, next slide please. Yeah, on the special areas of verification, now there can be various areas for verification. These are some of the areas that we have identified based on experience, what all they may look at. As I said, miscellaneous income is something which is very important, and they are likely to look at that. Then there are CSR expenses, gift to employees above 50,000, employee related transactions, because it is otherwise not taxable. They are going to look at minutely what you have given, what you have taken, etc. That's also one thing that needs to be taken up. Then transaction in securities, or for that matter, SCI scripts, whether there are appropriate reversals done or not, sale of fixed assets. These are something which typically gets missed out in large operations unless there are proper processes and controls in place. Whenever do you have a sale of fixed asset, you have to, reverse the credit or pay tax, whichever is higher, so that those things gets missed out. Export realizations, that's also one of the area that is hot favorite, because while we have exported, it may happen that within the time limit it doesn't come about, then there are implications to it, export status may be denied, so all those things may be looked at. One very innocuous kind of error can be, if the GSTN is not displayed in the place of business. It's a very minute compliance, but then it may, it may get missed out. So those are the things that they look at and may have some implication or some, kind of harassment or some kind of penal implications around it. Yeah. So noteworthy points. In the next slide, we are covering some of the noteworthy points for submission of documents, and it is very critical. These are few practical insights that we have seen across, various clients, various organizations, my personal experience also, that this gets missed out, and hence we have kept this slide so that we don't miss out these critical areas. One is, every document that goes to the departmental audit team or for investigation, whatever, for verification, it has to be reviewed and verified. Don't submit any documents or information without review and verified, because anything that you submit, if it happens to be incorrect, then the allegation could go into a different tangent. The activity may go into a different tangent. They may invoke fraud suppression, that you are kind of hiding things, you are not telling the truth, which may go into a different tangent. So everything needs to be verified, cleared, etc. That needs to be done. Not only that, we have to be very careful when we share the data. Don't, one of the, if there is a pressure, one of the very common thing is that, suppose they've asked for trial balance, you'll just take out the dump and send it to them, because they are on, especially this happens especially during investigations, when they are, they are in a very they are very aggressive during, if they are very aggressive and they want it right away, you may submit that. I've personally seen few cases where huge amount of demands have been casted basis the dump shared, because they have not been able to understand the debit credits. What does the debit, because they are after all tax officers, they are not accountants. They have not understand that, for a reversal of any transaction, there is a debit entry is there. They've only taken out all the credit entries and raised the demand. So demands have actual, whatever the tax they had paid, 4-5 times the demand is raised. This is completely insane. That may happen, it may go to that extent. So it's very essential that whatever we give, we just don't give the dump, we give data information after thorough review. Second thing is important is, we must have acknowledgement of whatever we have given. If there is no acknowledgement, tomorrow when you are litigating it, we may not be able to substantiate what we have done. No one will go to, unless there is a thappa or there is a acknowledgement, no one is going to accept that you have submitted these data. So it's very essential there is a covering letter with an acknowledgement for whatever we submit to them. Okay. And if it's an email, certainly there is an electronic, this thing is there when it's an email. I think one point that I missed mentioning when it reminds me on the email bit. One of the things the officers today do is, they give a Gmail ID. Typically, see, we all work in organizations, and in our organizations we have our organization IDs, right? And all the official communication should happen through these organizational ID. I fail to understand why they have to give their Gmail ID, which is not a formal ID, which anyone can create. You don't know whether the other guy is indeed a tax officer or a competitor also. So we should avoid having a Gmail ID. Again, with officers, when we have pushed across these points, some of the officers agreed and started sharing these notices or this asking for information through their official ID, gov.in ID. Some, especially the state ones, have been very reluctant, said we don't get information through that, you please share Gmail ID. We'll have to have a thin balance, again a delicate balance out of it, because we don't want to antagonize beyond a point to the officers. Probably the best course would be, when you say from a Gmail ID, the only risk that we see is, tomorrow they may raise their hand and say, look, this is a Gmail ID, the tax department has not received. Maybe that officer has personally received it, tax department has not received. We'll do what needs to be done with that officer, if indeed it is, if we find out it's his Gmail ID, but we have not received. That may happen. So therefore, we should, if we are giving something on Gmail ID, let's also have a formal physical letter filed with a acknowledgement stating that we have filed so and so, and maybe we can file the entire document with that. One very common mistake that happens is when we submit something to the tax office, we don't, because the data may be voluminous, we do not carry, or we do not have a copy of the annexures or the details, the voluminous details that we have shared. Friends, it can be very risky to do that, and we should in all circumstances avoid doing that. We should at least have one copy, complete set, right from the first page to the last page, available with us, what we have filed. Because tomorrow, if there is a litigation happen and we are before a tribunal or a court, and we show this, and they come, and we, if we have to show that we have already submitted this, and if we ourselves do not have that a copy, we have to recreate it. And you can understand, when we recreate after something after 3 4 5 years or more, then there is always a risk of we not being comfortable. People would have moved out, what was submitted maybe is different, and if it comes out what we submitted, what we are submitting is different than what is there in the record, then again it may go into a different tangent of fraud suppression. So we must always avoid, both under audits and investigation, this is a common point, that whatever we submit, we should maintain an entire ditto Xerox copy of what we have submitted with us. That's a non-negotiable. We should have a process in place to do that and have a file maintained for these things. It will really go a very long way in litigation. We feel very handicapped in many cases where this is not there, right? So yeah, these are some of the few points that we practical insights that we should keep in mind before, when we submit any documents, information in audits as well as in investigation. Yeah, next slide, please. So these are some rights and duties of the taxpayers, that rights are what he can have, what he, what needs to be there, and duties are what he's supposed to do. While it's more of theory, it's practically also a lot of it may be followed. But yes, it's not a hard casted stone. Again, it's not under the law. It's the charter, that taxpayers charter that we have seen. It's more recommendatory rather than compulsory kind of a thing. Okay, few of them I'll just, you can check their identity cards. 15 days time is there. We've already discussed a lot of it earlier also. That what are our rights, we can just scroll through for the paucity of time. I'll not get into individually details of this. These can be looked at. These are the things that can be, that we should keep, that we may keep in mind, but practically it may or may not happen the way it is mentioned in the rights and duties. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, coming to investigation. As I was mentioning, audit is something which is very, which if you look at investigation, audit is very cordial, very comforting, not to aggression in audit, unless it's, it goes off the roof in terms of timelines, etc. Investigation is something which can take ugly turn, and which invariably takes ugly turn. Maybe it starts, in fact, it starts with a very harsh tone or harsh things. Then we'll see how it starts, an investigation, and maybe over a period of time, if they realize there is no evasion, they may soften a bit. If not, then the aggression may even escalate. So that's how investigation, and we'll discuss a bit more in detail in terms of how investigation happens and what are the various things that we should keep in mind during investigation. Now, typically, investigation is something that gets carried out. Investigation is something which means that the tax office is sniffing some fraud, some suppression, some evasion of tax. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, the earlier slide, please. Yes. So yeah. So investigation is typically the agencies for investigation can be DGGI, Director General of GST Intelligence, which is a premier investigation agency, and they have all India jurisdiction. When you say all India jurisdiction, it means that they can go to, they can ask or summon information they can ask someone information for, say, they may be in Bhopal, while they may have unit in, they may have a office in Mumbai, but they can still ask for information in Bhopal for Mumbai. We have seen such cases coming up in service tax. It was very common. It used to happen both under DRI as well as DGCEI. Now in DGGI also, we have seen a lot of. So it becomes very inconvenient. Your offices are in location one, or maybe your offices are in multiple location. In one location, you are asking data for all India. While in GST, we have state level jurisdiction. They call us that each state is a different, distinct person. But when it comes to investigation, they may call all the information at one location, which may not be our main office location also. So that is something that we need to keep in mind, that it has all India jurisdiction. Then there are other agencies like anti-evasion or your jurisdictional office who may start doing these activities, who may start investigation. Okay. uh Now, yeah, next slide please. Okay, proper officer. Proper officer, now under the GST law, they have brought about that, if, because it's a dual levy, there are two tax officers that are there, and there are parallel jurisdiction. While your jurisdiction, your proper jurisdiction office may be one, either a state or a center, but investigation may happen from both the sides, either from central government. While your jurisdiction may be state, investigation may happen from center also. Now, since this may happen, there may be overlap. So one of the UN cry that was made is, what happens if there is an overlap? We will be subjected to multiple audits and multiple investigations. So the government, in the GST law, in section 6 of CGST Act, and corresponding in SGST Acts also, they have said that only a proper officer, and if one officer has taken jurisdiction, or who's authorized by the board, and he's taken cognizance of that investigation, then the state officer or the other officers should not do that. So once it's seized, the other officer should not be going ahead with the investigation. That's the kind of dual jurisdiction that they are kind of avoiding. However, when an investigation happens, uh, there have been one of the common thing that they may say, or rather an investigation, they don't say what they are investigating. They just call for information. So if you go back to them and say, typically I'm saying practically what will happen if they go back to them and say, look, center has already started investigation, you can't start investigation. They may give various reasons. They said, look, I don't care. Center must be doing their investigation. I'm not doing what center is doing as an investigation. So we may actually, despite this section being there, we may see parallel jurisdiction, parallel things coming up between both center and state. There have been few decisions also, both sides. If it's the same issue, if it comes out that what issue they're looking at is for investigation, if it's the same issue, certainly we can go to the High Court, and we can first, obviously, we can ask the officer to keep in abeyance. But if they don't do, we can certainly go to the High Court and say, look, this has already been taken care by by these other officers, so you should not be doing it. That can be done. And the High Court has ruled that this, you cannot have parallel jurisdiction, or same issue cannot be done. On the other hand, High Court have also ruled, if there are different issues that they are there, then the investigation can happen for both the jurisdictions. So it's, practically we will see a lot of investigation, multiple investigation may also happen, or likely to happen, given the way center and states, and it's the marriage of center and states, it's certainly likely to happen. This is also another thing, in a marriage, what happens, these are the few things between center and state that we as a taxpayers would be grappling with. Yeah, next slide please. Yes, inspection. Now, in an investigation, inspection is the most softer aspect, wherein an officer can access to the place of business. Mind you, here only place of business he can come. The place of business could be his warehouse, his office, his transporter, etc. That can be visited. It's more of inspection to see that if he has a reason to believe, or if he thinks there is something that is secreted there, just as an inspection he may come. It's again a softer one. He needs to have a proper authorization by a joint commissioner or officer authorized. That joint commissioner or an officer authorized by him can only do that. The authorization has to be in INS 01 as a form. Okay. And the reason is he has to have a reason to believe that is something suppressed, or there is an intention to tax evasion. and he can look at various things, transactions, stocks, ITC credits, or any other provision. He can look at those things, and transporters, etc. I've already spoken. Next slide, please. Search and seizure. Now, this is a step beyond inspection. Here we are talking about a search proceedings, which gets a bit more draconian or harsh vis-a-vis, the investigation. When a search seizure happens, that means again an officer not below the rank of joint commissioner or a person authorized by him can do the search and then seize the goods. First it's search and then the seizure. Search is INS 01 and seizure is INS 02. Now again, there is a reason to believe it's secreted, and goods, what is secreted? Either the goods are liable for confiscation, so they can seize the goods, or any document, things, books which they feel is relevant for their proceedings, their demand or their show cause notice, their investigation that is necessary, they may search and seize. Now typically, let me just give the scenario of search and seizure. How does this happen? It will I maybe many of us, many of you friends have not uh, seen any search or a seizure proceedings, and thankfully so, and I'll pray that you don't see any search seizure proceeding. But if it eventually comes about, it is necessary that we understand what this animal is, what is the kind of thing may happen, and we so that we are more informed when we deal with such seizures and search. So typically what happens whenever the search proceeding is carried out, typically the officers will come, okay, they will come with some punch witness. Punch witness can be a bank employee or can be someone who is in a nearby area. They typically come with, and this is not emanating in this will not, you will not find in the GST law. Many of this will, what I'm saying, will not file in the GST law, but it is coming from a CRPC or CPC, CRPC and CPC, and practical insights, practical experiences in how this happens. Typically, what will happen is the officers would come or with authorization, with punch witness. Now, the punch witness are independent parties, because the reason why they'll come with punch witness is under the CRPC or CPC, and in any investigation proceeding, it is necessary that this is done in a fair manner. So they may say the tax office are interested party and taxpayers are also interested party. So they want someone independent who can then say that what happened was all under the law. There was within the law, within the framework of law. That's the objective of these punch witnesses, to be there. They'll get some punch witnesses, or they'll ask us to, they'll get some punch witness from nearby area. Now the entire search proceeding will happen, and it is recorded in a document which is known as Panchnama. Okay, this Panchnama is a report written by these punch witnesses, and it will start with, look, the officers, 5 officers from the so and so wing came in this office, this address came, and Mr. so and so from the company, from XYZ company, came and met them. They offered their search. Who offered the search? The tax office offers the search. That's also one of the important thing that we should keep in mind. Under the in any kind of typically it happens in a criminal cases, where whenever the search happens, there may be an allegation that the tax officers have come in and planted something there. So therefore, in any search proceeding, in any of the even police search, etc., the first thing is that the officers they offer themselves for search, which the taxpayer can search. Typically, practically, no one does that, because we don't want to antagonize or we don't want to be this thing. So no one does that. But in the record, it will be mentioned they offered their search. Now, once that has happened, they showed their identity cards. This will be mentioned. The Panchnama, punch witness will mention, and then it will start. The officer went in XYZ in the first room. In the first room, there were few. These are the records that they looked at. Computer was taken up, data was taken up, and entire host of things, bit by bit, very detailed manner. They will narrate all the story or all the events that has happened in the Panchnama. Okay. Now, suppose during a search, if you say that if there is a locked drawer, etc., or in cupboard which is locked, and you say that you don't have a key, they may ask for you to get the key. If you don't have it, they may even break open that lock. Okay. One thing that I should mention here is this investigation need not happen. This search need not happen only at the business place. It may also happen in the residential area as well. your house or proprietor's house or the taxpayer's house. So it may go to residents also. Typically in corporates they don't, because it's all our employees. But if they sniff that there may be some information there, they may even search the residential premises as well. Okay. Now, once they do that, the entire complete Panchnama would be prepared of the demonstrating what happened in the entire search, and after that it will be signed by the punch witness, by the tax officers and the taxpayers. All of them will sign and agree that yes, this is the correct description of it, so that tomorrow, and this Panchnama can become an evidence. And it's a very important document. We have seen in the past during litigation, this Panchnama is a very important document. Typically in cases where there is frauds, etc., where actually there is a fraud and all, this Panchnama becomes a very key role. If it's not drafted properly, and if there are lacunas in terms of the way it is written, for example, somewhere it is written, it was a, say, a red color thing, and then in next, in some paragraph later it said it was a black color thing, then probably these anomalies can be used, exploited by the taxpayers or during litigation proceeding to say this was not a fair punch search that happened, and this is incorrect. So since this is incorrect, you cannot rely as an evidence. So it's very important that we have these things covered and we understand that how things happen, and it accurately records this thing. And this is a very important piece of evidence. Now, once the Panchnama happens, the next step that may happen is seizure. Now, for seizure, they may, if you feel that the goods are non-tax paid, their goods are liable for confiscation, they may seize those goods, or they may seize the documents information that is there. Now that seize, they will give you a document where they'll say that, we feel that it's relevant for the proceeding, or these are confiscated, these are liable for confiscation because they have contravened. And they'll give you the list of seizure, which is known as seizure memo, and there is some document name here. We'll see a little while, but that's a seizure memo which will provide the entire list of the documents that they have said. If, for example, the document, that goods cannot be seized, say it's a crane, then they may issue a seizure memo and they may give you a supratnama or a prohibition order to you, which may say that while we are not seizing the goods or taking custody of the goods, you are holding the custody of the goods, and you should not, remove the goods. You should not do anything with the goods. You should keep the safe custody of the goods. That's happened in seizure of goods, etc. Next slide, please. Now, the goods which are okay, the documents, etc., which are not relied upon must be, now the next, once, as I mentioned, the search seizure may happen, then it may culminate with the investigation may happen, and it may culminate into a show cause notice. Typically, once a show cause notice is issued, you must get the documents, original documents with us, which we have provided. But if that original documents is not, because if it is relied upon by in the notice, in the litigation, then certainly they will not give you the original document. We can insist on the copies of the original for our purposes, but original will not be provided if it's part of the, if they are relying upon this. Any non-relied upon documents, you can ask for the originals of it and you can take the originals. Then, if you want to provisionally release the goods, it may be, you may give a bond or furnish a security. Goods may be detained in INR 03, and I've already spoken about breaking open the seal, etc. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Then the disposal of seized goods, if it's perishable, hazardous goods, and they may do it, because there's a risk or loss, they may dispose of, sell the goods, etc. Which then, then if you win, then you can get the money back of, the consideration. Otherwise, it may be confiscated. Right? Documents I've already spoken. We can go to the next slide. These are the forms. I'll not get into details of this. I've already spoken INS 1, 2, 3. So, this, let's, this as an information, these are the forms in which the authorization or the order of seizure or prohibition may happen. Next slide, please. Yes. When are goods liable for confiscation? I said when they are liable for confiscation, they can come and seize the goods. They are liable for confiscation if it is made in contravention to provision of GST law. Goods are, so if it's, you have not paid the tax, etc., that may be there, or there are some contravention that has happened. There is no e-way bill, for example, that can be liable for confiscation. Or if there is, if the movement of goods, if conveyance, the truck, etc., can also be confiscated if it's carrying something which is goods are liable for confiscation. You have not applied for registration and still you have cleared the goods, then those can be confiscated. These are the various things that can result in confiscation of the goods. And once the goods are confiscated, confiscation and Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. Now there's a difference between detention, confiscation, and seizure. Seizure is taking possession of the goods. Okay. Ownership lies with the taxpayer. Possession comes with the tax office. Detention is ownership and possession, both with the taxpayer, but you can't do anything with the goods. You can't remove the goods, etc. That's detention. Confiscation is ownership and possession gets taken up by the taxpayer, by the tax authorities. And if you want to release it, there are provisions which says that you have to pay a fine in lieu of confiscation. That you pay the fine and you release the goods. Now, suppose the goods have been already cleared, you don't have the available goods, then this fine may need not be paid. There are jurisprudence in the earlier law in the customs, etc., and the fine is not payable because the goods are not available for confiscation. We'll see how probably in GST also it should go the same way, but let's see how the litigation develops in GST. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, some noteworthy points here again before we go to the next slide. Here, proper authorization should be there. Reason to believe, we'll discuss this in the next slide. What is reason to believe? And documents seized under INS 02, just putting across whatever we have spoken, summarizing it. Inspection can be carried out any place of business, but search seizure, as I mentioned, can be done even at the residential place. Seizing inventory of goods seized will be given to you. Please make it a point to take the inventory of seizure of the goods whenever the goods or the documents get seized. And prohibition is INS 03. That is the form if there are prohibitions attached to it. Next slide, please. Yes, reason to believe. Now, typically we have seen in the inspection, etc., that there is investigation. There is a reason to believe. Reason to believe is not defined under the GST law, or for that matter, any tax law. In the Indian Penal Code and all, reason to believe means a sufficient cause. Now, one question may come up is whether can you come back and say that this is a reason to believe? Can we do that? That what is your reason? Can we ask that what is your reason to believe? Answer is no. We cannot ask the reason to believe. They are not obliged to disclose. The tax office are not obliged to disclose what is the reason to believe. Typically, if the things get out of head, or it gets out of the roof, and we have to go into litigation, and we have to file a writ, in those cases the court may direct what is your reason to believe, etc. That may happen, okay, during that point in time. Otherwise, it's it is there, and some of the court jurisdiction that I've mentioned is it should be rational connection between, it cannot be vague, it has to be honest, reasonable belief, etc. So these are some of the rationals that the courts have held. Typically, it is only in exceptional cases that when we have to go in writ against the seizure or the search proceeding or investigation proceedings, that becomes relevant. Otherwise, you can't, you can't do anything about the reason to believe. They'll say they'll always have a reason. Next slide, please. Yes. Now, friends, this is the most critical aspect of the entire discussion of search seizure, because this is the most important aspect of any investigation proceeding, which I thought I should, we'll spend some time while it's been more than an hour, but I think it is important. We'll take some time here, and this slide will just cover. Summon is probably the most widely used, most draconian tool or handle that the tax office has. What summon mean is that they are calling you, or they may ask you to have your presence there, while it can be by an authorized representative also, for providing information, documents, etc., which may be relevant for their proceeding. That's how they can do the summon. Okay, they can issue a summon. Once a summon is issued, it has to be obliged and it has to be attended to. If the summons are not attended to, then they may go and they may get an arrest warrant also. That's why summon, whenever you receive a summon, it has to be taken extremely seriously, and actions needs to be taken in a summon proceeding. Okay. Now, once you are summoned, okay, they typically ask for the first document. Once a summon is issued, the document itself is very intimidating. So don't get intimidated by the document. There's a standard form. The reason why it gets intimidating is the document would mention that any false information or any non-obedience of the summon, etc., proceedings under section 193 and 228 of the IPC, which is the Indian Penal Code, or criminal proceedings can be started against you. This makes people really, really intrigued, especially in MNCs, large corporates, and the summons may be issued. Then they really get very terrified by the language. It's a standard language. No need to get terrified by it. Okay. So it's a standard language. So don't worry on this. And we must attend this summon. Now, summon, why it is so powerful tool with the tax office is because what happens in a summon, if tomorrow they may put pressures by someone. For example, they may summon the CFO, CEO, chairman of the organization to provide evidences. Unnecessary for large corporates, MNCs. This becomes really, then everything gets escalated. It gets to a different level altogether. You will understand if a CEO or CFO is summoned. So therefore, it becomes, and that's a pressure tactics that they may apply in various things. So we need to, it has to be handled very delicately and carefully so that it doesn't get escalated and things get closed at a lower level. That's how that's why it's very powerful. Now what happens in a summon, once you go and attend the summon, typically if they've asked for information, they'll review the information and they will record your statement. Most cases they will record the statement. Once you have given the information, it will start with that you have given so and so information, this is what is coming out, and they'll ask various questions. Typically a summon proceeding, or a statement, I'll give you some like I gave for Panchnama. Let me just give some glimpse of how the statements are recorded. Statement is a report that is being written by the person whose statement is taken. So it's not the officers that I am asking, it is the taxpayer or person who is summoned. He'll write that I have visited so and so on so and so date, my name is so and so, my father's name is so and so, my residential address is this, my mobile number is this, all these things, information that has to be written. My date of birth is this, I'm working from this company, this is my ID proof that I'm this designation, and all this personal information will be there. So that's recorded in the statement. They'll take your identification card also. They may ask even for authorization that you are authorized by the company to represent the company if it's a corporate, unless it's a personal summon. And sorry, I missed mentioning one point. Someone can be in the name of the company, then anyone can within the company can go. Someone can be named in the individual, then individual must go. As I said, authorized representative can go. In most cases I've seen, they don't like authorized representative, so most of them they strike off that. If they insist on a person to come, then that person has to come. And once the summon happens, a statement gets recorded. This is, as I already said, these are the starting contents of the statement, a preface of the statement. Post that, the questions would be on being asked by the officer whether you have raised this invoice or not. I come back, I wish to state that yes, we have raised the invoice, or I'll check and come back, etc., etc. These are the question answer that happens depending on the investigation. Questions would be asked, and that needs to be reported or recorded in a statement. Typically, the way statements are recorded is not that while it is a report from the taxpayer's point of view, what I have seen is the statements are typed by the officers. Okay, they may take your contents and they may type it. You may have objections on some of the language that is being used. Say for example, you don't accept the liability, they may write something innocuous or something which favors them, because they want to draft it. They don't allow you to draft. They'll draft it and they'll show it to you and they'll ask you to sign. So while it's a pull and push depending on how important that information is. You may push them to say this, this I don't agree, you need to change it. You may not push them. You may kind of, if it's not too much, or if they are taking a hard stance, that then you may go get away with this, or you may just not do. You may just sign it and maybe follow up with a letter that this was mentioned, but I don't agree with it, which can also be a bit difficult, because then he may summon you again and then it may be more harsher. So we'll have to have a thin balance or a delicate balance maintained for for these things. Now, so when the statement is recorded and then you sign the statement, the officers also sign the statements. Typically they don't give you the copies of the statement. Only I think in my entire career I've seen one or two cases where they've actually given during investigation a copy of the statement, but otherwise they never give you the copy of the statement. So it is always a healthy practice that once you come back out of your memory, you mention whatever it is, okay, that you have stated, and maybe take a legal view or a consultant's view in terms of whether anything needs to be done in such statements. Whether if there is something which you didn't want to say, but it is written, then probably there are various methods. We may retract the statement if it is too damaging, or if we think that they've played high-handedness and they have written what they have written, which you don't agree. Or you may just send a clarificatory letter stating this in the statement. I've mentioned this, but I didn't mean this. It has been incorrectly reported. I realize this is not correct. We may just mention very softly. Some more strategically we can do that. Now, another thing in summon proceedings you must keep in mind is it may be very intimidating. I said earlier also, the way it can be intimidating is when you go there, they will try and, since you will be surrounded by officers, they'll try and play all the kind of tricks that is there. See, one thing we need to understand: whenever the investigation happens, these officers were earlier the officers of the customs also, where they were looking at the smuggling, RDX smuggling, gold smuggling, drug smuggling. So they deal with criminals. So therefore they have that kind of a stance, that kind of an approach towards the investigation. However, with the corporates, I've seen they are quite softer than they are, which I know of, which than they are with the criminals, like drug peddlers and all. They are a lot more softer. But yes, they have that kind of a tinge, or they have that kind of a approach, especially to intimidate whenever if they want to intimidate. So typically, I've seen what may happen in most summon proceedings is when you are called, you may not, your mobile phones may be taken up. They may not give you access to mobile phones, and they can do that, and they do that very regularly. They do it so that you are, you feel intimidated in the first instance. Then they may intimidate you by giving you kind of warnings, or saying that, look, if you don't cooperate, we may arrest you, we may put it in newspaper that your so and so company has defrauded so and so. It will come in newspapers. These are the threatening ways that they say. They may even, and just in the closed room that I'm mentioning, they may even show you videos how they beat people, or how they do manhandling. They may do so. We have seen few instances where they do so. Or they may kind of play around like this, that in front of you they may slap someone who may be their own officers, etc., just to show, just to put you under pressure. All these things they do. Typically they do all these things in the customs investigation, but certainly in GST investigation also they are capable of doing, because it's the same officers from a tax office point of view, from CBIC, the same officers. So they may do that. So corporate, I have not seen much of this happening, but we must be prepared for all these things. A lot of times, even in the GST regime, in the service tax regime, etc., for people who are very senior, who are especially who are foreigners who come into India, are respectable high position, they may get really, really very intimidated, and it may be very frustrating, because they may be asked to sit there for 6-7 hours without anything. The whole day may go, while there are various kind of good to approaches where between sunrise and sunset it should happen, all the search and investigation and summons. They may not follow that. Practically I don't think they follow that kind of an approach, unless and until they see that it's not a fraud transaction, it's more of an interpretation, and they are cordial. Over a period of time they become softer, then it's different. But otherwise they always approach a high-ended approach. They always have a high-ended approach on these investigation proceedings. Yeah. So, and ultimately their last objective after this entire investigation is to get a recovery, because they get their brownie points, or maybe some awards, if they are able to recover some money in terms of the tax payment, that if you agree. And for that they typically use this high-ended power of summoning the senior officials of the company, so that you get to avoid this kind of aggressiveness, you may pay this amount. So this may happen, but typically they don't have the powers to collect money. And in case if they are insisting and they are getting threatening, writ can be filed, and very regularly writs are filed in these kind of cases. So it can be filed against them, and let them issue a show cause notice. The correct proceeding is through litigation. Let them issue a show cause notice, and then only they can move ahead. And and once an order is issued, then the normal course, as in the law, that may happen. That's broadly on the summon. As I mentioned, this is one of the most, because see why it is most draconian is because a person gets involved, and this statement that has been tendered can be used as an evidence. So I'll just make a stark difference between this and the summons by a police officer or a statement before a police officer. If a statement is recorded by a police officer in some criminal case, that confessional statement cannot be used as an evidence against you in the court of law. Whereas in case of customs, GST, etc., if a confessional statement that you have said that yes, I've evaded so and so tax, it can be used as an evidence against you. So therefore, in a corporate environment, a personal implication can be there. And in when we are in corporates, we while the company may litigate the case on merits, and it may take years in India to complete the litigation. But if there is a person whose whose statement is recorded, and who's kind of, because corporate cannot be doing fraud suppression, right? There has to be some person who does fraud suppression within the corporate doesn't have a mind of its own. Then if something of this said they allege, typically they may want they may ask a taxpayer or a officer of the company who they implicate that he is the one who is kind of undertaken this fraudulent activity, which may be very, very intimidating, because then a personal show cause notice can be issued imposing penalty on the officer. So you may or may not be there in the company, so that becomes a bit of gray area or a bit of challenging situation personally for the employees when we have this summon proceeding, which is why people are really scared, or it is draconian, and I'll pray that it doesn't happen to any of us. But yes, if it happens, then we need to keep this in mind, and maybe a good option could be we have undertaking from the company to, if at all a penalty is imposed, and because unless there is a fraudulent actual fraud that is happening by the person, then the company should help us or help fight the litigation, because litigation may go 10-12 years, and also oblige in making the payment on behalf of the employees. That's the practical approach that people take if these things happen. So there is an undertaking, even if the employee leaves the organization, because tomorrow you are not, you may move to other organization, but this litigation may still be there on your head. So this is something that we must keep in mind, and must undertake corrective action or a preventive action for during investigation. I think that's it from my side on summon statements, etc. Yeah, before we'll have a Q&A session for some time. But before we have a Q&A session, there is one commercial break we would want to take. There is a tool that we have developed for GST compliances, which helps compliances very quickly and smooth manner, and GSTR1 to reconciliation in 3B. We'll just play a short video of a minute for everyone as a commercial break, and post that we'll have a Q&A session.
The fast-paced business environment demands hassle-free, timely and efficient GST compliance management, which can be a challenge. Nextime's specialized GST team, combined with our in-house technology platform, have devised Simplified GST, a solution that offers an integrated approach which generates GSTR1 and ITC reconciliation using output from GSTR1 and ITC reconciliation. GSTR 3B and refund workings are generated. This helps manage your compliances and relieves your burden. Our in-house technology and client-centric team is equipped to help clients with mapping of registers for compliance activities, data sanitization, processing transaction-wise reports, performing validation checks, and generating reports and compatible return formats for uploading on the GST portal. These activities will lead to considerable savings in time and valuable resources. Nextime's Simplified GST will definitely improve efficiency and simplify complicated compliances. Partner with Nextime for all your GST compliance needs. Write to us at thinknext@nextime.com to explore the areas we can support.
Thank you. So, Jitin, can you help me with the questions? I can't see it in my mobile. It's difficult to get. Can you help
Sure,
me with
Saket.
questions?
Sure, sir. So we have a question. What is the time limit for completing the audit? I think you've covered it, but if in a very gist you want to sum up.
See, we have already covered what is the time limit for the audit. It is, within 4 to 6 days, depending on, 10 to 12 years, depending on the years of the audit. It can be, if its audit period is 1 year, for large taxpayer, it is 6 to 8 working days is what is there in the law. Okay. Or as per the CBIC manual, medium taxpayer 4 to 6 working days, small one 2 to 4. And if you are covering 5 years period, it's 16 days, 12 days, or 8 days. Now that's again, it's a more of a recommendatory timeline. It's not a timeline that is under the law. It may go more than that, but that's the timeline. And the limitation for period of audit, for what period they can open up, that depends on the limitation of litigation. Just 3 years if there is no fraud and suppression. If there is fraud and suppression, then it can be 5 years from the end of the period of filing the annual return.
Thanks, Saket. Next question is, our offices work from home till 31st December 21. Our GST audit for 17-18 and 18-19 is going on. Please let us know if they can insist to visit office.
See, COVID is a very exceptional situation. Okay. And they may see, so practically you may take a stance of not visiting the office and share the data, whatever is information is there, that is there. But if they insist, then it's more of, it's as I said, it's an exceptional situation where you can, for health reasons, you may ask that, you may request for doing it online. But if they ask for, depending on how you want to conclude the audit, we may take position. Typically, if they ask for once or twice, it may be beneficial, unless and until you actually see a risk of COVID. Then or you don't want to come. You don't want to, then we can take a stance and we can approach the higher up in case they insist on it. But yeah, they may insist on it, and it's practically, it makes more sense if they insist on it. We just have it closed as soon as possible. In case because of COVID there is a problem, we may seek extension unless things get more. If it's some surge etc. in COVID, then we may take an extension. But in a normal situation, yes, typically they have a right to visit and carry on. In case your offices are closed, probably we can mention that and seek some time or do it online.
Sure. Next question is, what is the position of employee resign after signing of statement?
Okay, position of employee resign. See, when a statement is recorded, okay, statement is recorded while in a capacity of you an employee, but as personally also involved in it. In case, depending on the context of the statement, etc., if there is any implication, suppose if it's only a factual information that you've already given the statement which they need for investigation, and it's an interpretation issue, etc., then probably there may not be any implication even if you've resigned. But if there is a fraud suppression that they're alleging and they see that your involvement is there, it may or may not be there, but according to them your involvement is there, then even if you've resigned the company, the penal application or a show cause notice can be issued to you. That's why it's so draconian, that if they feel that, look, there is a fraud suppression or there is evasion of tax that has happened, and Mr. XYZ, who was the employee that point in time, then who was involved in it, then a penal provision penalty can be there, and you will have to fight your litigation. Even if you've resigned with the company, you will have to fight your litigation.
Thanks, Saket.
So it's only thing that I would advise is more from to safeguard ourselves as employees. It is essential that we must take an undertaking from the company that that when we are handling an investigation or we are front-ending an investigation, if there is any penal implication or a litigation or any cost that gets in this thing, then even if you have resigned the company should reimburse that. Otherwise, we did everything for the company, and today we are liable for a penalty, and penalty can be quite high. Penalty and investigation and litigation cost. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Saket. Next question is, if the dealer has multiple locations in single state, how will be the investigation carried out?
The investigation can, if it's a multiple they may visit any or all your premises if they want to visit. Okay, they may visit and they can start investigation, or they may also visit, or they may call for the information from, and then if they call for information, whichever location in the state that you have where you have the information, you can go and provide the information. And sorry, I just mentioned, forgot to one thing mention. Whenever you go in any investigation, etc., avoid taking your laptops, because they have the power during investigation to take your laptop and take all the data. And in laptop, you may have innocuously written various emails, etc. Those emails can be there, which can be used. So avoid them giving access to the laptops. So when you go for a search summon some proceedings, please don't visit with the laptop. Let it be in the car or in the office. You go without the laptop unless they have asked for it. They will ask for documents. Carry those documents. Don't carry laptops. It can be, it's a good hygiene thing that needs to be taken care of. And in any search proceedings, the one thing they do is when they come for search, they may take your laptops, they may take your computers, and they may extract information data from there.
Right, Saket. Next question is, what is the alternate in case of 2A mismatch ITC wherein service provider has reported in B2C or missed reporting?
So what is the implication? See, for the past period, certainly we can take a stand that if he is misreporting, the matching concept was not there, reconciliation was not there, we have a reasonable good case in terms of, even if it's misreporting, etc., to litigate and to take the credit. I mean, while it's a different issue altogether, but okay, let me just answer this question. However, from now, I think there is an amendment where matching of credit needs to be there on the government portal, or the 2A should be reflected, which is not yet notified, I believe. In those cases, or maybe in future, it will be litigative if it is not there. It is always better in such circumstances if the portal allows you to have the rectification done, have the rectification done. If it's missed also from B2C, you can report into B2B. If that can be done, better you do it. If the time limit is already passed and portal is not allowing you to do that, probably take an undertaking from and that's the practical advice we are giving, to take an undertaking from the vendor stating that, look, by error or by whatever reasons, I reported in B2C. However, I've paid the tax. This is, while my GST at 3B, and I have, this is the invoice, and these are services for goods were provided to you. Everything is there, but unless by mistake I've reported in it. This can be used as an evidence tomorrow if during any investigation or any litigation. Look, I have done all these things what is needed, and therefore there should not be any implication.
Right, Saket. Next question is, who will take care about GST audit, whether central or state team, if my administration jurisdiction is central?
Then it should be the central team for audits. Central team, your jurisdictional office may be there. SERA is another kind of this thing who may come. That SERA audit is basically an audit of the tax officers. So that is there under CAG. That audit may happen, but otherwise your jurisdiction will be at a central level because your central offices are there. However, investigation can be by anyone, any of them, even though your jurisdiction is at central.
Right. Next one is, what if dealer is assigned to central jurisdiction but state authority initiates investigation?
That can happen, as I already said. That can happen and will happen. Even if your dealer, cross investigation can happen by anyone.
Right. The next one is, officer can insist for 2A ITC difference before the period of applicability of ITC matching October 19.
Sorry, can you just repeat?
Can officer insist for 2A ITC difference before the period of applicability of ITC matching October 19?
See, the way the officer will ask is matching, in the sense what he'll ask is, you justify your credit. When he say matching, he would say that whether he has paid tax or not. So he can ask you an information whether the credit that you have taken is correct or not. Now, in that sense, how will you justify the credit is taken by invoices, etc.? He may ask for information, and they have been asking for this information. We can't avoid providing this information if they ask for it, even if for the past period. Okay, we can't avoid that doing that. So that needs to be provided to them. However, if it goes into litigation, even if it's mismatches, we have a good case. If there are other factors which govern the credit provisions, if all are satisfied under law, that is, you have the invoice, you have paid, the vendor has paid the tax, etc. If that we can demonstrate, then certainly we have a good case. But certainly they can ask for information during audits investigation.
Sure. Thanks, Saket. Last question for the day, Saket. What if summons issued to director? Will he in person has to appear, or authorized signatory of organization can appear?
See, I'll tell you, if a summon is issued to a specific person, okay, then that person has to appear. Okay, that's the expectation also. However, practically it's a pull and push. Practically, we avoid having a director represent or director go. Typically, what we do is someone who's junior from a director, or someone who's looking at, say, a tax manager or a tax head, or someone, maybe as junior but who can handle reasonably senior but not too senior, can go there attending the summon with a letter of authority stating that, sir, I know of the information. My director, obviously, he looks at a he has a very bird's eye view. So I'm here. I'll provide you whatever information is needed. You tell me whatever that you need. Typically, I've seen this approach works well whenever they want to just get some information. And what typically I have used whenever personally I have been part of this, I typically say, so look, sir, they are they are foreigner. They don't understand India. They don't understand all these things. So they'll not be able to provide what you need. So unnecessary, why waste time for them? I'm here. You tell me what you need, and I'll provide you the information. So once they are satisfied, typically they don't insist on director. But in case they insist on director coming, then the director has to go there.
Right, Saket. Thank you. So we end the question answer session here. I think we've overshot the time. Thank you, Saket, for the presentation. It was very interesting and insightful. I would like to thank our speakers and sharing his valuable insights on the subject. I'm sure listeners too have found it relevant. If you have any questions in line with the discussion today that we were unable to address due to time constraints, we welcome you to reach out to us at thinknext@nexttime.com, and our team would be happy to respond to you offline. Across the globe, we think next at Next Time, and we invite you to do the same. We welcome your feedback on today's presentation. Be vigilant and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.